In the freezing darkness of a December night in 1944, somewhere deep in the forests of Belgium, a young black American soldier named Horace Woodard sat alone in a muddy foxhole, shivering not just from the cold but from pure terror. He was thousands of miles from his home in rural Mississippi, fighting a war that many people back home said he had no business fighting, serving in a segregated army that treated him as less than human, even as it demanded he risk his life for freedom. In his trembling hands he held something that seemed absolutely ridiculous for a combat situation, something so ordinary and domestic that anyone who saw it would have laughed or thought he had lost his mind. It was a box of soap powder, the kind his mother used to wash clothes back home, brought from the supply depot by sheer accident. Little did anyone know that this simple box of cleaning powder would become the key to destroying one of the most important German supply bridges in the entire Battle of the Bulge, an operation so daring and so unlikely that even decades later military historians would struggle to believe it actually happened. This is the story of how one man's desperate creativity, fueled by a lifetime of making something out of nothing, turned a household cleaning product into a weapon of war and changed the course of one of World War II's most critical battles. Horace Woodard was born in 1923 in a tiny community outside Tupelo, Mississippi, where life for black families meant working from sunrise to sunset in cotton fields that would never belong to them. His father had died when Horace was only 7 years old, leaving his mother to raise 5 children alone in a 2-room shack that leaked when it rained and felt like an icebox in winter. From the earliest age, Horace learned that survival meant being clever, resourceful, and always finding ways to make things work when you had almost nothing. His mother was a washerwoman who took in laundry from white families in town, and young Horace would help her, learning every trick she knew about removing impossible stains, making soap last longer, and creating cleaning solutions from whatever materials they could find or afford. When other kids played after school, Horace was mixing lye and ash, stretching soap supplies, and figuring out chemical reactions without ever knowing the scientific names for what he was doing. He attended a segregated school that met only 4 months a year because black children were expected to work in the fields during planting and harvest seasons. But his teacher, an elderly woman named Miss Carey, who had taught herself chemistry from borrowed books, saw something special in the way young Horace understood how substances mixed and reacted. She would give him extra lessons after school, teaching him about acids and bases, about how different materials could be combined to create powerful reactions, all explained in simple terms that a poor country boy could understand and remember. By the time Horace turned 18 in 1941, the world had exploded into war, but for black Americans in the Deep South, the immediate dangers were often closer to home than any foreign battlefield. Horace had already survived 2 encounters with white mobs, had learned to keep his eyes down and his mouth shut, and had developed an almost supernatural ability to disappear into the background, to become invisible when danger approached. When the draft notice came in early 1942, Horace had mixed feelings about serving a country that had never treated him as a full citizen, but his mother told him something he would never forget. She said that sometimes you fight not because everything is fair, but because you hope that your fighting might make things better for those who come after you. She also told him to keep his wits about him, to remember that his brain was his best weapon, and to never forget all those lessons about mixing and making things work that they had learned together over the washboard and soap kettle. When Horace boarded the segregated train car heading north to basic training, he carried with him not just his few belongings, but an entire education in practical chemistry and resourcefulness that the Army would never recognize or value, but that would one day save countless lives. Basic training at Camp Claiborne in Louisiana was a brutal introduction to military life, made even worse by the systematic racism that permeated every aspect of the United States Army in 1942. Black soldiers trained separately, ate separately, and were housed in the worst barracks on the base, often without proper heating or adequate equipment. They were assigned to labor battalions, quartermaster units, and service companies because the Army believed or claimed to believe that black men lacked the courage and intelligence for combat roles. Horace found himself assigned to the 555th Quartermaster Company, a unit responsible for hauling supplies, digging latrines, and doing the dirty work that the white combat units considered beneath them. The irony was not lost on Horace that he could be trusted to handle ammunition, fuel, and explosives as cargo, but not trusted to actually fight with those same weapons. During training, the black soldiers received cast-off equipment, outdated weapons for practice, and instruction from white officers who often made no secret of their contempt for the men they commanded. Yet within this oppressive system, Horace found a strange kind of freedom in the supply depots and warehouses where his unit worked. He began to understand the vast complexity of military logistics, learning what every container held, how different materials were stored and transported, and most importantly, how various substances could react if exposed to certain conditions. In August of 1944, 2 months after D-Day had opened the Western Front in France, the 555th Quartermaster Company finally received orders to ship out to Europe. The crossing was miserable, with the black soldiers assigned to the lowest decks of the transport ship, where the air was stale and the rolling of the vessel made almost everyone sick. During the 2-week voyage, Horace spent his time studying whatever technical manuals he could get his hands on, reading about explosives, bridge construction, and engineering principles, driven by a hunger to understand how things worked and how they could be made to not work. When the ship finally docked in Southampton, England, the reality of war became immediate and terrifying. Even in England, supposedly safe behind the lines, the evidence of German bombing was everywhere, and the steady stream of casualties flowing back from the continent made it clear that this war was far more terrible than anything the newsreels back home had conveyed. The company spent 3 weeks in England, stockpiling supplies and preparing for the move to France, and during this time, Horace witnessed something that would stick with him. A British demolitions expert was giving an informal presentation about German bridge construction and how difficult these structures were to destroy, requiring massive amounts of explosives placed with precision. The expert mentioned almost as an aside that certain chemical reactions could weaken structural steel if given enough time, but that this was impractical in combat situations where speed was essential. In September, the unit crossed the English Channel and entered France through Utah Beach, where the debris of the invasion still littered the sand and the smell of death still hung in the air despite the weeks that had passed. The 555th Quartermaster Company moved inland, following behind the advancing American forces, establishing supply depots and keeping the endless flow of material moving forward to the combat units. The work was hard and dangerous, as German artillery still reached back behind the lines, and the roads were constantly strafed by whatever remained of the Luftwaffe. The black soldiers worked around the clock, loading and unloading trucks, sorting supplies, and watching the white combat troops get the glory while they did the unglamorous work that actually kept the army moving. Horace saw his first real combat when a German patrol infiltrated behind American lines and attacked their supply depot near the town of Saint-Lô. In the chaos of that firefight, with bullets cracking through the darkness and men screaming, Horace discovered something about himself. He was not paralyzed by fear. Instead, his mind became sharper, faster, more focused. While others panicked, he methodically grabbed a rifle, found cover, and held his position, helping to drive off the attackers. After that night, something changed in how some of the white officers looked at him and his fellow black soldiers, a grudging recognition that perhaps courage was not determined by the color of a man's skin after all. As autumn turned to winter in 1944, the Allied advance that had swept across France since D-Day began to slow and then stall along the German border. The 555th Quartermaster Company found itself positioned in Belgium, near the Ardennes Forest, an area that the Allied command considered a quiet sector where exhausted units could rest and new units could get their first taste of the front line without too much danger. The days grew shorter and colder, and an early winter brought snow and freezing temperatures that made every task harder. Horace and his fellow soldiers settled into a routine of moving supplies, maintaining equipment, and trying to stay warm in inadequate shelters while rumors circulated about a final push that would end the war before Christmas. The black soldiers had become expert scavengers, supplementing their often inadequate rations with whatever they could find or trade for. And Horace had developed a reputation for being able to fix or improvise almost anything. When the company's water purification system broke down, he jury-rigged a replacement using materials from a destroyed farmhouse. When someone needed to remove rust from weapons, he mixed up solutions that worked better than the official Army issue. His methods were unorthodox and often involved materials that had nothing to do with their intended military purpose, but they worked, and that was all that mattered to the men who depended on them. On December 16, 1944, at 5:30 in the morning, the world exploded. German artillery began a massive bombardment across an 85-mile front, and then through the snow and fog came entire German armies, appearing as if from nowhere in a massive surprise attack that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. The Allied lines shattered under the assault, and suddenly the quiet sector became the most dangerous place on Earth. The 555th Quartermaster Company found itself directly in the path of the German advance, and the orders came down to evacuate, to fall back, to save what supplies could be saved, and destroy the rest. In the chaos of the retreat, units became separated, communication broke down, and small groups of soldiers found themselves cut off behind rapidly advancing German lines. Horace was part of one such group, a mixed unit of about 20 men from various companies, both black and white soldiers thrown together by the chaos of battle. They included combat engineers, infantry stragglers, and supply personnel, led by a young white lieutenant from Boston named Robert Chen, whose parents had immigrated from China and who understood something about being treated as an outsider in America. Lieutenant Chen quickly proved himself to be a capable leader who judged men by their abilities rather than their skin color, a rarity in the Army of that era. The small mixed unit of American soldiers spent 3 terrifying days moving through the frozen Belgian forests, trying to evade German patrols and find a way back to American lines. They almost had no food, limited ammunition, and only the winter uniforms they wore for protection against temperatures that dropped below freezing every night. 2 men died during those first 3 days, one from wounds sustained during the initial German attack, and another who simply froze to death during the second night when he fell through ice crossing a stream and could not get warm again. The survivors were exhausted, hungry, and beginning to lose hope when on the 3rd day they stumbled upon a small Belgian farmhouse hidden in a valley where a family named Dubois was still clinging to their home despite the fighting raging around them. The family consisted of an elderly couple, their adult daughter, and 2 young grandchildren. And these brave people took in the American soldiers despite the tremendous risk, hiding them in the barn and sharing what little food they had. The father, Monsieur Dubois, spoke some English learned during World War I, and he brought the soldiers devastating news through his broken but understandable words. The Germans had established a major supply route running through the valley just 2 miles from the farm, and they had rebuilt an old stone railway bridge to carry their tanks, artillery, and supplies forward to the attacking troops. This bridge, Monsieur Dubois explained, was critical to the German advance in this sector, and Allied aircraft had already tried twice to destroy it, but had failed because the bridge was built in the 1800s with massive stone supports that could withstand enormous damage. The Germans had reinforced it with steel beams and kept it under constant guard, with at least a full company of soldiers protecting the approaches and anti-aircraft guns positioned to drive away any planes that came too close. The Belgian man pulled out a hidden map and showed Lieutenant Chen the layout, explaining that if this bridge could be destroyed, the entire German supply line for this part of the offensive would be cut, potentially stranding thousands of German soldiers without fuel, ammunition, or food. Lieutenant Chen understood immediately that this was intelligence that had to get back to American command, but radio contact was impossible. They were at least 15 miles behind German lines, and trying to travel that distance through enemy territory would almost certainly result in capture or death. As the group debated what to do, Horace sat quietly in the corner of the barn, thinking about what he had learned from the British demolitions expert back in England, and remembering something about chemical reactions that could weaken steel supports given enough time. That night, while the other soldiers slept in exhausted heaps on the hay in the Dubois barn, Horace lay awake thinking through a problem that seemed to have no solution. The bridge had to be destroyed, but they had no explosives, no way to get explosives, and no way to call in an airstrike. Even if they had possessed explosives, approaching the heavily guarded bridge would be suicide, and the stone construction meant that even if they somehow succeeded in placing charges, they might not do enough damage to actually bring it down. Every conventional solution was impossible, but Horace had spent his entire life finding unconventional solutions to impossible problems, making things work when he had nothing to work with. He thought about the chemistry of corrosion, about how steel could be weakened through certain chemical reactions, about the soap-making formulas his mother had taught him that involved lye and acids and other caustic substances. He thought about the supplies they had managed to carry with them during the retreat, the random assortment of military and civilian materials that soldiers accumulate, and then he remembered something that seemed completely unrelated, a box of industrial soap powder that had been in his pack, intended for laundry but never used because they had been too busy running for their lives. When morning came, Horace approached Lieutenant Chen with an idea that sounded so crazy that at first the lieutenant thought the private might be suffering from exposure or shock. Horace explained in simple terms that anyone could understand that certain chemical compounds could initiate rapid corrosion in steel, especially when combined with moisture and applied under pressure to stress points. The soap powder he had was not ordinary soap, but an industrial cleaner that contained high concentrations of alkaline compounds, and if mixed with other materials they might be able to scavenge, it could potentially be turned into a corrosive paste that would eat through steel beams much faster than natural rust. The key would be identifying the exact stress points on the bridge where the steel reinforcements were bearing the most weight, applying the corrosive mixture to those specific points, and then giving it time to work. The beauty of this approach was that it would not require them to fight their way onto the bridge or even to be detected. They could potentially apply the mixture from underneath the bridge, in the darkness, and then withdraw before anyone knew they had been there. The Germans would never suspect such an attack because nothing like it had ever been attempted before, and by the time the corrosion weakened the beams enough to cause a collapse, the Americans would be long gone. Lieutenant Chen listened to this explanation with growing amazement. He had no training in chemistry, no way to verify if what Horace was proposing could actually work, but he recognized the same kind of creative problem-solving that wins wars when conventional approaches fail. The lieutenant called together the 3 combat engineers who were part of their group and asked them to assess the feasibility of Horace's plan. These men, trained in bridge demolition and structural engineering, were skeptical at first, but became increasingly interested as they discussed the specifics. One of them, a sergeant from Pennsylvania named Mike Kowalski, admitted that he had heard of accelerated corrosion being used in industrial settings to weaken metal for removal, but never in anything like what they were proposing. After hours of debate and calculation, the group reached a consensus. The plan was crazy, had probably less than a 50-50 chance of working, and would require them to get close to a heavily defended target with no backup and no way to escape if things went wrong. But it was the only plan they had, and doing nothing meant the bridge would continue to funnel German supplies forward, meaning more American soldiers would die. Lieutenant Chen made the decision they would try it, but he made it clear this would be a volunteer mission only. No one would be ordered to risk their life on such a desperate gamble. Every member of the small group of soldiers volunteered for the mission, a fact that surprised none of them because by this point they had bonded into a tight unit where the usual divisions of race and rank had been burned away by shared hardship and survival. The next step was gathering the materials needed to create Horace's corrosive mixture, and this required a combination of military supplies and civilian materials that would have to be found or improvised. The industrial soap powder was the base ingredient, but Horace explained that they needed to increase its corrosive power dramatically, which meant adding acids and other caustic agents. The Dubois family, showing courage that bordered on recklessness, offered to help search their farm and the abandoned neighboring farms for anything that might be useful. Monsieur Dubois brought them old agricultural chemicals from his barn, including containers of ammonium nitrate fertilizer and bottles of sulfuric acid that had been used for cleaning metal equipment. His daughter risked her life walking to 2 other abandoned farms in the area and returned with more containers of industrial solvents and cleaning agents that had been left behind when the families fled. Over the next day and a half, Horace worked like a scientist in the makeshift laboratory, mixing and testing different combinations of materials in small batches to see which created the most aggressive corrosive reaction. He had no proper measuring equipment, no safety gear, and no way to precisely control the chemical reactions, but he had his lifetime of experience and an intuitive understanding of how substances interact. He mixed the soap powder with the sulfuric acid, added portions of the ammonium nitrate, and combined these with several other components, including salt, which would accelerate the corrosive process, and a petroleum-based substance to help the mixture adhere to vertical metal surfaces. Each test batch was applied to pieces of scrap metal that the engineers provided, and they timed how long it took for visible corrosion to begin and how much the metal weakened. The results were encouraging but not perfect. The mixture worked, definitely creating rapid corrosion, but it was difficult to predict exactly how long it would take to weaken a structural steel beam enough to cause failure under load. Sergeant Kowalski estimated that if they could apply the mixture to the right stress points, they would need somewhere between 12 and 24 hours for the corrosion to weaken the structure enough that the weight of a heavy load, like a column of German tanks, might cause catastrophic failure. The other critical piece of planning was reconnaissance. They needed to know the exact layout of the bridge, where the German guards were positioned, when patrols happened, and most importantly, where the key structural stress points were located. This required actually observing the bridge up close, a nearly suicidal task. Lieutenant Chen and 2 others, including Horace, made a nighttime scouting mission to within 100 yards of the bridge, crawling through the snow and hiding in the shadows of the forest. What they saw was both encouraging and terrifying. The bridge was indeed heavily guarded, with German soldiers at both approaches and machine gun nests covering the crossing. But the area directly underneath the bridge, where a small frozen stream ran, appeared to be less observed, because the Germans assumed no one could approach through the water without being seen from above. The bridge itself was a combination of massive stone piers and steel support beams, exactly as described, and Horace could see even from a distance the pattern of the steel reinforcement. The engineers had been right that the steel beams were not the primary supports, but rather reinforcements added to strengthen the ancient stone structure. which meant that corroding the steel might not bring down the entire bridge, but could weaken it enough that heavy loads would cause a collapse. On December 22, 1944, 6 days after the German offensive began, the temperature dropped to nearly 10 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, and a light snow began to fall, conditions that were miserable for the soldiers, but perfect for their purposes, because it meant reduced visibility and guards who would be more focused on staying warm than on watching every shadow. The plan called for a team of 5 men to make the actual approach to the bridge. Horace would lead because he was the only one who fully understood what needed to be done with the chemical mixture. Lieutenant Chen insisted on going because he would not ask his men to do something he would not do himself. Sergeant Kowalski volunteered his engineering expertise to identify the exact points where the mixture should be applied. The other 2 were selected because they were the quietest movers and best at remaining unseen. Skills that in Horace's case had been learned not in military training, but in years of navigating the dangers of the segregated South, where being noticed by the wrong people at the wrong time could be fatal. They blackened their faces with mud, wrapped cloth around their equipment to prevent any noise, and each carried containers of the corrosive mixture that Horace had prepared, about 20 pounds of the thick, caustic paste that gave off fumes so strong they had to be careful not to inhale too deeply. They left the Dubois farm at 10 o'clock at night, moving in complete silence through the forest. The journey to the bridge took nearly 3 hours, even though the distance was only 2 miles, because they had to move slowly, stop frequently to listen and watch, and detour around German positions. The forest was full of enemy soldiers, and twice they had to freeze in place, lying face down in the snow, while German patrols passed within yards of their position. The cold was so intense that Horace lost feeling in his fingers and toes, and he worried that he would not be able to do the delicate work required once they reached the bridge. But he forced himself to keep moving, to stay focused on the mission. When they finally reached the streambed below the bridge, they could hear German voices above them, the sounds of vehicles crossing, and the metallic clanking of a tank column moving across the structure. They waded in the freezing water of the stream, hidden beneath the shadow of the bridge, until the tank column had passed and the sounds above reduced to just the occasional footsteps of sentries. This was the most dangerous part. They had to climb up to where the steel support beams were attached to the stone piers, apply the corrosive mixture to specific points that Sergeant Kowalski had identified, and do all of this without making any sound that would alert the guards just 20 feet above their heads. For Horace and his group, the immediate problem was survival. They were still trapped behind enemy lines. The area was now flooded with angry German soldiers searching for whoever might have sabotaged the bridge, and the successful destruction of the structure had actually made their situation more dangerous because the Germans were on high alert. Lieutenant Chen made the decision that they needed to move, to leave the Dubois farm before their presence there endangered the family further, and to try to make their way back to American lines. The Dubois family gave them what food they could spare, provided warmer clothing, and Monsieur Dubois drew them a map showing the best route to try that would avoid the heaviest German concentrations. The farewell was emotional, because everyone knew that the family had risked everything to help them and that the chance of the soldiers surviving the journey was slim. Madame Dubois pressed a small religious medal into Horace's burned hand, whispering in French that God would protect him because he had done a great thing. The soldiers left on the night of December 24th, Christmas Eve, moving once again through the frozen forest, following a route that would take them east and south toward where they hoped American lines still held. The journey back to American lines took 5 more days, 5 days that became a blur of cold, hunger, fear, and exhaustion. The group had to avoid German positions, navigate through a landscape that had been torn apart by battle, and survive on whatever they could find or scavenge. They lost 2 more men during this journey. One stepped on a mine that had been hidden under the snow and died instantly. Another was shot by a German sniper when the group was ambushed while trying to cross an open field, and he died despite Horace's efforts to stop the bleeding using techniques his mother had taught him for treating injuries on the farm. The survivors kept moving because stopping meant death, driving themselves forward on willpower alone when their bodies had nothing left to give. On December 29th, more dead than alive, they stumbled into an American position manned by the 82nd Airborne Division, which had been holding a critical junction against repeated German attacks. The paratroopers almost shot them because they looked like walking corpses and could barely speak coherently enough to identify themselves as Americans. But eventually they were recognized, given medical attention, hot food, and most importantly, believed to be safe for the first time in 2 weeks. Lieutenant Chen immediately reported what they had done to his superiors, explaining about the bridge and the method they had used to destroy it. His report was met with skepticism bordering on disbelief. The officers who interviewed the group seemed to think that Chen was either lying, mistaken about what had actually happened, or trying to take credit for a bridge that had failed for other reasons. The idea that a private, especially a black private, could have conceived and executed such an operation using improvised chemicals seemed impossible to them, beyond the boundaries of what they could accept. The fact that there was no documentary evidence, no photographs, no other witnesses beyond the members of the group themselves made the story even harder to credit. The Army had a rigid hierarchy of how things were supposed to work, and that hierarchy did not include black enlisted men acting as chemical engineers and demolition experts. Over the next several days, as the group recovered in a field hospital, they were interviewed separately by intelligence officers who were trying to determine if they were fabricating the story or if they had actually accomplished what they claimed. It was only when aerial reconnaissance photographs were compared with earlier images showing that the bridge in question had indeed collapsed in a manner inconsistent with air attack damage, and when intelligence reports confirmed that German offensive operations in that sector had stalled due to supply problems, that the Army began to take the story seriously. Even then, there was reluctance to fully acknowledge what had happened. The official after-action reports credited the bridge's destruction to structural failure induced by Allied bombing, making no mention of any ground operation or chemical sabotage. Lieutenant Chen protested this falsification, arguing that his men deserved recognition for what they had accomplished, but he was quietly told that the Army had reasons for not wanting the true story made public. Some of these reasons were practical, related to not wanting the enemy to learn about the technique that had been used, but other reasons were less admirable, rooted in the military's unwillingness to acknowledge that a black soldier had played such a critical role in a significant operation. Chen was told he would receive a commendation for leadership during combat operations, and his report would be filed in classified records, but no medals would be awarded and no public recognition would be given. Horace and the other enlisted men were simply sent back to their original units, their service records showing nothing beyond routine duty during the Battle of the Bulge. For Horace, this was both painful and familiar. It was the same story that had played out his entire life, doing extraordinary things, but being denied any acknowledgement because of the color of his skin, succeeding despite the system, and then watching the system erase or minimize his success. Horace and the sergeant worked together, with Horace using his bare hands to apply the thick paste to the steel beams at the junction points where they bore the most stress. The mixture burned his skin on contact, even through the cold, but he ignored the pain and focused on getting the coverage right, making sure the corrosive material was packed into every crevice and gap where the steel met the stone. They worked on 4 separate support points, 2 on each side of the bridge, applying all of the mixture they had brought. The whole operation took nearly 40 minutes, though it felt like hours, with every second bringing the possibility that a German guard would shine a light down and spot them. Lieutenant Chen and the other 2 soldiers provided security, watching the approaches and ready to create a diversion if they were discovered, knowing that if shooting started, they would all probably die, but hoping at least to give Horace and Kowalski time to finish. Finally, the job was done. Every container was empty. Every identified stress point had been treated, and now all they could do was withdraw and hope that the chemistry would work as planned. Getting back out was almost as dangerous as getting in, because the first gray light of dawn was beginning to show in the east, and their dark forms would be visible against the snow. They moved as quickly as they dared, retracing their route through the forest, expecting at any moment to hear shouts or gunfire that would mean they had been spotted. They made it back to the Dubois farm just as full daylight arrived, exhausted beyond words, half frozen, and with no way to know if their night's work would accomplish anything. Horace's hands were severely burned from the corrosive mixture, the skin blistered and raw, and Madame Dubois had to treat them with what limited medical supplies she had, while Horace gritted his teeth against the pain. Now came the hardest part, the waiting. They estimated that if the chemical reaction worked as Horace predicted, it would take at least 12 hours and possibly as long as 24 hours before the steel was weakened enough to fail under load. The problem was that they had no way to observe the bridge without risking exposure, so they could not know if the corrosion was progressing or if the mixture had simply frozen solid or been washed away by condensation. All they could do was wait in the barn, taking turns watching and listening, hoping to hear some sign of success. The first 12 hours passed with no indication of anything happening. German traffic continued across the bridge, the sounds of vehicles and armor moving in both directions as the enemy kept pushing supplies forward to their offensive. Doubt began to creep into everyone's minds. Had the plan failed? Was the chemical reaction not strong enough? Had they applied it to the wrong points? Lieutenant Chen tried to keep morale up, reminding everyone that even if this particular plan did not work, they had done everything possible and would find another way to complete their mission. But Horace sat quietly, consumed by the fear that his idea had been foolish, that he had risked everyone's lives on something that could never work, that his presumption in thinking a poor black kid from Mississippi could solve a problem that trained engineers and military experts had said was impossible had been pure arrogance. He thought about his mother back home, probably standing over a washboard at that very moment, and wondered what she would think if she knew what he had done. He thought about all the people who had told him throughout his life that he should not aspire to anything beyond his station, that he should accept the limitations placed on him by society, and he felt a deep shame at the possibility that they might have been right all along. The 15th hour came and went, the 16th, the 17th. It was now late afternoon on December 23rd, and the light was beginning to fade again. The soldiers were discussing whether they should attempt another approach to the bridge, maybe trying to plant some kind of improvised explosive made from the ammunition they still carried, when they heard something in the distance. It was a deep, grinding sound, like metal tearing, followed by what sounded like thunder but was not thunder. Every person in the barn froze, listening. Then came shouts in German, panicked and urgent, and the sounds of vehicles skidding and crashing. Monsieur Dubois ran outside despite the danger, scrambling up to a small rise where he could see down the valley toward the bridge. When he came back 5 minutes later, his face was split by an enormous smile and he was crying. The bridge had collapsed. Not completely, but one entire side had given way, sending the steel beams plunging into the stream below and taking several vehicles with them. The stone piers still stood, but the roadway had fallen, and the bridge was completely impassable. The American soldiers looked at each other in stunned disbelief, unable at first to comprehend that the impossible plan had actually worked. Over the next few hours, as darkness fell, the group could hear chaos in the German lines. Vehicles were backing up, unable to cross the destroyed bridge, and the sounds of angry voices and confusion carried through the cold air. The Dubois family, using their knowledge of the local area and their contacts with other Belgian civilians who had remained behind, gathered intelligence about what was happening. The bridge collapse had caught a German supply convoy in mid-crossing, destroying at least 3 trucks and blocking both approaches with wreckage. More importantly, this bridge was the only crossing point for heavy vehicles for miles in either direction, because the other routes were too small or had been destroyed earlier in the fighting. Without this bridge, the entire German offensive in this sector was cut off from resupply. The tanks at the front would run out of fuel, The artillery would run out of shells. The soldiers would run out of food and ammunition. It was exactly the kind of logistical catastrophe that could turn the tide of a battle. German engineers arrived and began assessing the damage, trying to determine if the bridge could be repaired quickly, but what they found baffled them. The stone piers showed no damage from explosives, yet the steel reinforcement beams had failed catastrophically, corroded through at critical stress points in a manner that seemed impossible to have occurred naturally in such a short time.